Just to clarify, when I say a game is overrated, I'm not saying that the game is bad. It simply means that the game is perceived as better than it actually is, in my opinion at least. Before we discuss whether Last Epoch is overrated, I think it is important to first talk about what my expectations were for the game before I started playing it. I can't remember exactly when I first heard about Last Epoch, but the first time I started taking it seriously was after watching a video from this arpg content creator called Zizaren. In his video, Zizaren discussed all the good things about Last Epoch, and he did not have one single bad thing to say about the game. I did not think much of it at that time, but after watching that video, subconsciously I started having really high expectations about Last Epoch. By the way, this was when the game was still in early access. Then, on February 21st, 2024, Last Epoch was finally released. I did have to suffer through long loading screens and being unable to log in from time to time. However, these are temporary issues, so I'm not including them as part of my critique. After a simple character creation, you'll be greeted by this story cutscene. I could critique the low production value of the cutscenes, but I think that's beside the point. Because simple cutscenes can be charming and expressive too, if done right. However, I'm going to critique the storytelling of Last Epoch because it is simply not good, to say the least. First, let's break the story down into two main components: the writing, which includes the story itself and the world around it, and the execution, as in how the story is being told over the course of the game. We will talk about the story first. A huge thanks to user Angelcrest on the Last Epoch forum for this fantastic piece of article documenting the entire story of Last Epoch. I will link the article in the description, and I highly recommend that you give it a read. Without this article, I wouldn't be able to discuss the story itself simply because I stopped trying to understand the story after 3 hours into the game. We will talk more about that later. After reading the article, I realized that the story of Last Epoch is complex, expansive, and surprisingly good. There is actually a coherent storyline with clever plot points to link all the content pieces in the game together. For example, there's this character named Zarek, whom you will meet towards the end of the campaign. He becomes your companion and plays a crucial part in getting you access to the final boss of the game. Well, the final boss for the 1.0 version of the game at least. But many of you might not remember, there is also a boss in the earlier part of the campaign called Spy Master Zarek, who is this abomination that you have to fight. These two Zareks are actually the same individual, you simply meet them at two different points in time. The good guy Zarek is from the earlier part of the timeline, whereas Spy Master Zarek is who he would eventually become 1,000 years later. This is but one of the many interesting twists in the story, where you first meet the future version of a character by time traveling, then come back to the current time to meet a completely different present version of the same character. Unfortunately, it became apparent very quickly that the story is simply too ambitious for ESG, the developer of Last Epoch, to convey effectively. The cutscenes are often used to add dramatic effects and ambiguity to the events, rather than to provide the much needed narration on what is actually happening. The dialogues are alright, but without proper context, they become just lines of words that are a waste of time to read. To make things worse, the voice acting is more often a miss than a hit, and when they are bad, they are really, really bad.
I see you've spoken with the armor-clad woman. She may be flippant, but she intends well.
For me, the experience of trying to follow the story was so painful that I couldn't bring myself to do it anymore after just a few hours into the game. Nonetheless, I recognize that most of you are not playing Last Epoch for the story, so I will not dwell on it longer than I already have. Instead, let's switch gears and talk about the combat and itemization, as they are the core components of an ARPG. The combat in Last Epoch is adequate, but it is not something that will blow you away. I feel that ESG is intentionally toning down the flashiness of skill animations to prevent screen clutter, and I must say, it is quite effective. This, coupled with the fact that enemies' moves are mostly well telegraphed and hitboxes are accurate, makes damage and even one-shot deaths in this game feels very fair. However, I do wish that there is a bit more oomph and effects behind the skills. What Last Epoch has at the moment is too simplistic and doesn't really get me hooked. There's also a certain clunkiness with the controls in Last Epoch. There seems to be a problem with input buffering, where half of the time my second input will not register if I press the buttons too quickly in succession. The skill animation is also slightly too long for an ARPG, which affects the fluidity of the gameplay as well. Itemization is something that Last Epoch received a lot of praise for, so what I am about to say next is going to be quite controversial. I think there's one major design flaw in the itemization system: item bases and their corresponding implicits. Unlike many other ARPGs, the item base of your equipment is extremely important in Last Epoch. Using the right item base can mean getting up to 3 additional highest tier affixes on your gear, so it is a no-brainer for players to exclusively pick up and craft on item bases that are good and relevant to their build. What this also means is that at least 80% of loot drops in this game are completely obsolete simply because they are of the wrong item base. As a result of this, in-game gear grinding is overinflated, where you can farm for hours just to get 1 or 2 viable item bases to drop, then proceed to lose them to bad RNG during crafting. The frequency that players are rewarded for their effort is simply too low, hence the grind just doesn't feel good enough. I think ESG should either reduce the number of item bases in the game, or come up with ways for players to target farm certain item bases to increase the drop rate of items that are actually useful for the players. Before I end the video, I want to quickly mention one last aspect that many other content creators have already covered: the endgame monolith system. To be brief, there is just not enough meaningful variation to keep the monoliths fresh, so it gets stale really fast. I had to push myself to grind to around 250 corruption, which took about 3 hours of playtime, and I couldn't bring myself to do it anymore after that. I understand that there will be more endgame content to be released in the future, but for now, I will have to call a spade a spade. Ultimately, Last Epoch is not a bad game, but it is not a great game either. It has a great but poorly executed story, slightly clunky and plain combat, a flawed itemization system, and a boring endgame grind. The class and skill systems are really good though, just to be fair. I wanted to share my thoughts on Last Epoch because there are a lot of mostly positive reviews out there that might make the game sounds better than it actually is. But that's just my opinion. Do you think Last Epoch is overrated as well? Let me know in the comment section below. That will be all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. A like and subscribe would mean the world to me. Thank you so very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.